so I start making some little putty worms. Brighten up my frogs, flowers. What, your 3D printer doesn't have a name? Welcome to Castle of Paint. My name is Ian, and today we're going to be painting a tree hugger. I've been a long-time fan of another YouTuber, Scott the Miniature Maniac. He does entertaining and informative content that I think every mini painter should take a look at. In fact, he is one of the key reasons I'm making videos like this right now. When I moved abroad, it sent my hobby into flux, and Scott's videos, along with others, helped me solidify into what I do now. Also, the dude did a goddamn Kickstarter with some awesome miniatures, and so I had to take the plunge and pledge. Recently I got files for those minis, so let's print one off and make it come alive. Quick note on the Mini. At the time of filming this, I don't have the resin cast miniature, but I do have the STLs, so we're going to be turning liquid into Sexy Wood Elf. In the future, when I get the resin casts, perhaps we'll do a comparison video. Maybe? Anyway, let's try to shine some light on some goopy stuff. That was cut a tad short. We're going to need taller miniatures next time. Taller. Let's talk about process. I don't consider myself any kind of drawer, but I wanted to begin with a sketch. This is to make the idea come to life from my wavy brain stuff and give me direction for everything afterwards. I would love to say this is so rough to keep some mystery for that viewer retention, but it's more that I need to practice a bit. As with all models, we need to give it a bit of post-processing, some sanding and filing of the mini so that the sculpt doesn't look all strange. Printed and glued, but we still have some gaps to fill in. Last video I talked about how I'm new to the process of gap filling on minis like this, and one comment suggested I mix green stuff with Milliput. So that is precisely what I tried here. I mixed some putty snakes, pushed them into the gaps, and tried to smooth it out so it looks natural. Once it is dried, I go back to sanding with paper and files to try and smooth out any imperfections in my gap filling. I think I did a much better job on this model than the last, and plan to use modelling putty more later in the build. Let's make a start on this miniature by laying down some base tones. My reference images are the following images from the Kickstarter. One, a picture of the Mini, painted by Miniac himself. I'm not trying to copy this completely, but since he designed this Mini, I feel like it's a good place to check for what should be what colour. These tones will be my shadow colours, and so as dark as each section will be. I'll paint the tree he is standing on with a dark brown. His clothes will be different mixes of greens and browns, and his belts and buckles will be another type of brown. So much brown. I'm using a lot of mixing here, as I try to keep my paint choices consistent. If I add the same dark grey to my green or my brown, I'm hoping it will tie those parts of the model together. I will likely be doing the same as I build up the highlights. On the branches of the trees, there is a kind of mossy lichen stuff, lichen, and I thought I could match that into the model, so the elf has the same colour for his cape. In my mind, I see him doing this as some sort of nasty wood elf camouflage. This part of the painting process is very enjoyable for me. I'm slowly bringing this miniature to life through the application of different colours, and all I really need to consider is what parts should be what colour, and try not to paint outside the lines of course. Let's speed up this process, and I'll read you the lore of the miniature taken directly from the Kickstarter. Some say Kishore wasn't born, but rather stole his way into existence under the nose of the gods. Not everyone observed the world as he did. No one else remarked upon the colour of a bear's roar, the mellifluous song of the wind between the trees' branches, or the smell of despair as he watched Otero grow into a wood and iron monstrosity. His symphonesia seemed to grow as his home became more corrupt. The intensity of his badly wired senses became a cacophony of noise and smells. He could hear the humming of iron and smell the industry of his kin. The forest cried out against it. This was not how Otero was meant to be. Kishore's head was thrumming with the noise of the bloating city until it fell silence and was replaced with the image of a witch. Once I have enough base coats added, we can see a glimpse into how he should look when finished. I do this so I can get a sense for where things should go next. For the metal, I use a really dark metallic colour. This is a section I am unsure about what I'm going to do with it. There is not much metal on the Mini, and I wanted to fit the theme, but I don't think I'll be able to do anything decent with NMM, so I stick to using nice metallic paints. For the scarf I went with an emerald colour, breaking away from the reference images a tad, mainly because I love this colour. With a lot of the base tones added, let's do the mushrooms. I reached out to my sister, who is a bit of a mushroom expert, and she advised me that they look a bit like these mushrooms show in the reference images. So I want to make them have an orange colour scheme. I used a yellow-brown colour mixed with grey to be my base here, and I'm really looking forward to bringing these up to a very bright orange. I want to push the shadows on my wooden sections because I didn't mix the base tone with a dark grey or anything else. So instead I'm going to give it a wash. I use a purple wash in order to start to give things a tinge. The wash is a good choice here as there are a lot of very small cuts into the sculpt for the wood, and trying to paint each one with a darker colour would lead me to madness. The wash has dried. Now it's time to start finishing off individual sections of the Mini. I start with our friend's wooden log. I take the base colour and we add a small amount of our highlight colour. In this case I'm using a bluish purple, as I want the elf to have a slightly evil vibe, and we all know evil elves love purple. Here we walk through the layering process. I add a touch more violet blue to the base tone and add a layer. Add a bit more and add another layer. I'm always trying to find the places where the light would hit, but also add enough colours to the rear parts of the model to make sure they do not look forgotten. This is a hard balancing act, but one that is important. As we move towards the highlights of this section, we can see it becomes more and more purple. This is good. But also we don't want to have a fully purple log, we just want a tinge. Tinge is the word of the day. To keep this going in the right direction, I start to add some ice yellow. This will give me a brighter colour, temper the purple, and not desaturate it like a white would. Then we go to just ice yellow and some blue violet for my final highlights, where I use my better brushes and add some very thin highlights and some scratches along the edges. Now we're going to do the cape, and I'm going to try a new technique, new to me at least. Those who have seen my other minis will know my blends are not the smoothest, so I'll be trying to use glazes as much as I can while working on this piece. A glaze is essentially a very transparent layer of paint, normally caused by thinning the paint down a lot with either water or some glaze medium. The idea works just the same as the layer I normally apply, but then being more transparent should mean that I can get a much smoother transition. Here you can see I'm mixing the base colour I have already used on the cape, and then I add a small amount of my chosen highlight colour. I keep checking the colour against the Mini as I can make sure I'm starting from a consistent point. With the base colour sorted, I add some blue violet to bring it up from my shadow colour and start to apply a very thin coat. You can see I water it down a lot and then remove any excess moisture on a damp bit of paper towel. With hopefully the right consistency of my paint, I start applying the layer. I try to aim the end of my stroke to be towards the part where it would be lightest. This is because the start of the stroke applies the least amount of paint. This can be hard to do, and sometimes I just have to accept the angle I need. I keep adding layers of my glaze, trying to brush it to where the light would make the cloth look brighter. I add some ice yellow to the mix in an attempt to bring up the brightness for a highlight. The only issue being that my mix is now missing its green tinge I was aiming for at the beginning. I found that mixing paints a lot can lead to this if I'm not careful, something to work on more. I didn't film the next few layers of glaze. I was just so busy focusing on trying to add my glazes properly. But here we can see I've managed to get a semi-decent transition from a darker green grey to a brighter grey. Now we need to keep going and add more contrast. As we get towards the brightest highlights, we are very close to pure ice yellow, and I tried to do some scratchy lines for highlights. Still very watered down to be like a glaze, this proved to be a bit of a challenge around brush control, as when the paint is that consistency, it's hard to do highlights. With the cape looking great, it is time for something else. There is a slight section of the shoulder which looks like it's made from small bits of wood or bark. You can see on the reference images that it's painted to look like bark but has a very strong green tinge. More of that tinge word. For this effect I take a nice leaf green from Vallejo and paint it into the cracks of each of the bark segments. This gives it a bit of a mossy look, a green wash over the whole thing. This will make the recesses darker, the green overall a bit darker, and the brown will get, you know what, a tinge. Now it is on to the booties. There are a lot of browns on this Mini, and I want to keep them all slightly subdued to fit in with the theme of the piece. Here is another good attempt to practice the glazing. I take my midtone, add a tiny bit of my highlight colour, here ice yellow like most things these days, and I start to attempt to glaze. His boot that is at the back of the piece is much more covered and so would have a lot less light than the boot on the front. This colour is also used for the miniature's tunic. Here the part around the belly is in a much deeper shadow, so I stop adding layers here after a few goes. Stopping the glazes on the shadowy parts mean I already have some contrast against the brighter parts. The brighter parts here are getting more and more ice yellow added to the mix and slowly glazing on another layer followed by another layer. As we move up in the brightness, the mix here is more ice yellow than a midtone. With this I then hit some of the details that are so small a blend would be hard to see on them. I quite like the effect this has on the tunic, but I think a smoother blend from the dark to the bright is needed here. I often wonder how people can spend so long painting a miniature, but the more I paint larger things, the more I can see how I could spend a long time glazing darker and lighter here to try and make it look closer to life. With our booties done, yes, I will take any opportunity to say that word. Let's finish that bit of bark. I really should have gone and got a bit of a reference image for bark, but instead of that, I just started to highlight by adding a highlight color and starting to layer, leaving the dark green and also the dark brown. Add more highlight color as we go, but I don't want to push this too far, as it needs to read as brown and not as yellow. With our bark shoulder guard done, let's get funky. I love this emerald color I used for the scarf and loincloth, so I was looking forward to this section. It's also another good spot to try my glazing. Hoping to avoid the same highlight colors for every part of the model, I mixed my green grey with some violet blue, again to try and add some purple into the mix. This is the same as we did for the dark wood of the base, all about tying things together. I found this harder to glaze as the ridges in the fabric gave me less room to work. After some glazes with the blue violet, we started to add the ever favourite ice yellow. I sometimes find that my glaze consistency is often not right here, and it's more of just another layer than a glaze. With our scarf done, it's time for his trousers. These get the same treatment as the scarf by taking our shadow colour and adding violet blue to the mix, and then start to glaze. This section is another bit of good practice in considering shadows, as on the leg would not have much light at all, and we want that to be slightly visible. So on the side of the leg you can see here I'm only taking the next layer down so far. With these layers I sometimes just do multiple glaze layers, and sometimes I add more of the highlight colour. Just like with the section before, we need to be careful about the consistency to the glaze, otherwise it will be too opaque and so lessen the blend. As I add more layers I start to add my ice yellow highlights to push the brightness on this section of the Mini, always considering where the light would hit, covering less and less as we continue. It's mushroom time. I compare these to the reference images I have for this type of mushroom, and I think this orange tone will be a nice splash of contrast and add a lot of interest. It's been a long time since I painted orange, so this might be difficult. My base colour was mixed with grey to make the shadow colour, and I want these to be bright, so I jump straight back to my base colour, Citadel Baylor Brown. I have limited surface area and I want to jump up pretty fast here. After that colour I add some bright as balls orange to the mix. I'm hitting the centre of the mushroom and the rims, leaving the middle section that I feel be darker. Because these mushy mushies are layered on top of each other in the sculpt, I can do some fun stuff with shadows, and by fun, I mean don't paint bits to save time, yes. I add more of the bright orange to the mix and add more layers. As I keep highlighting, I'm trying to draw lines inwards towards the raised part to give the mushroom texture. After some rounds with just the bright orange, we start to add yellow to bring it up some more and be even more careful to have the lines going in from the outside. Let's add some more base colours, because who base coats everything at the start, right? I use a nice leaf green on the back of the quiver, and then once again I get lost in the process and start doing something else. This time it's the straps. This was brown and dark grey, so we add brown, and then we add brown plus the highlight colour. Here we take a big departure from what we've done previously, and we use a bone colour as the highlight. There are lots of thin strips here, and so it's important to make very thin lines with each new highlight layer I do. On sections such as the strap around the chest, I make the lines not match the angle of the strap. This is back to our texture point from before, also because the light would not just hit the edges here, and we want some diversity to the paint job. After some lines are added, I bring the highlights up and then add more lines. These scratchy highlights are also there to try and make it look like worn leather. Eventually, we just use pure bone paint to touch up some of the very small parts of the straps. I also paint this badly sewn on patch to his leg. Now I got over my strap fetish, I go back to the quiver. Here I use a purple wash to get into all the recesses for what looks like a quilted fabric on the quiver. I use this because trying to paint into the recesses would take way longer, and I'm not too worried about real shadows here. While that dries, I paint the base of the bow. Here I use another brown as a base, one that I've not used before. This is because we have a lot of browns already, and I don't want to make this look like any of the others. We also based the horns. I had a little look on the reference image as I wondered if these were coming out of his skin or not. It seems this is more of a headband, as around the back of his head there is a band that keeps these attached. So we're going to paint the horns or antlers bone. My base bone colour is this burnt umber brown, but I'm not going to finish that part yet. We have his face to do, and so I'll likely do them both at the same time, so we move to somewhere else, the metal. I've been playing around with some washes to tint metallics recently, and so this is what I do here. For this we use a GW contrast paint, basically a very highly pigmented wash. This gives our dark metal a blue tinge. It does darken down the recesses, but I'm not too bothered about that as we already have a very dark colour as a base. While that wash dries, I move back to the quiver. I often like these quilted details as I find it's pretty easy to make them look decent. I take the base green I used and apply it, then add some ice yellow to the mix and apply another layer. Each time I add more, I'm trying to cover a slightly left surface area. Remember earlier when I talked about the moss on the log matching the cape? Well, that plan kind of went out the window. Since I ended closer to grey with the cape, I needed to switch things up for the moss. I kept the purple out of it and just went up the highlight scale like I would do normally. However, this time I tried to add another new to me technique and tried to stipple on the colour. I want the moss to look mossy, well, of course, and I want to give it some texture. Kind of similar to how I try with the belts. Here we're using dots and not slashes to make that work. The mossiest of all moss is done. It is now time to go back to metals. I'm still a bit lost here, so I wing it. I take a silver and I add it to the edges of the metal. Let's hope that's enough to not make it look like I phoned it in. There are some other things to base, the bow being one. Let's base some wood appropriate tunes and get those layers added. This miniature doesn't come with a base or anything, so we're going to have to make him a badass plinth to stand on. Here I'm using Fusion 360 to digitally sculpt the plinth. I pull up the top with a slight taper as I want roots to go around this part of the plinth. Then I make an area for some badass quote. All I'm doing here is making simple sketches and then extruding or cutting into the object. Here you can see him cut a hole in the back of the plinth. I wonder what is going to go there later. Finally, I cut some angled sections into the top. Later on we will fill these with mud and dirt, and I wanted to look like mild variations on the forest floor. With this done, it's time to print on old Doris. What, your 3D printer doesn't have a name? Stick it into the slicer, get some supports added, and then it's time to roll some creation themed tunes. The magic of 3D printing done, let's clean up the base and blue tack our boy to it. I do this so I can mark out where I need to leave clear for him later. I printed some trees and flowers too from some other manufacturers, links in the description. And for this scaling was a bit of a problem. As you can see, some of the flowers I have were way too large. The smaller ones seemed to work pretty well though, so I add them to the base. Now we're back to the putty. Using similar mixtures and tools like before, I want to add some variation to the base. I take the putty and add it to the cutouts I made before. This is to give it more of a gradual slope up to the top. I also add a teeny tiny hill. Hopefully with flock and rocks on this it will still show up. Now we get to the tricky part. I want to add roots to the front of this plinth. So I start making some little putty worms, and I add them to the front, curling them up between each other. I found this to be less painful than expected, but only a brown paint job will tell if they look more like roots or strange tentacles. While I was feeling brave and confident in my use of putty, it was time to go full tilt. In the bottom of the plinth I have that hole, remember? My plan for this is to have an evil heart there, living underground and corrupting all around it. For this I use the same putty and have a nice reference image. Then I start to sculpt a big ass heart from scratch. As you can tell, it kinda worked. I used wetted silicone or metal tools and pushed or scraped the putty to kinda be in the places I wanted it. For the heart tubes, scientific name, I poke holes using the metal tools that have a bit more of a tubey look. After doing the main section, I let it dry and come back later. Now the main parts are solid, I can file it down, trim some sections, and finally add some more tubes. For extra tubes, I just use plain green stuff and use the same tactics as before. With that done, it's the best bit of the piece, basing time. I add a texture paint to the underground cavern with some bits of flock, and then start to add mud texture to the top, bits of cork, multiple bits of type of gravel, and finally I seal all that in with some watered down white glue. Here is a quick spin to see what we got. I'm very happy with the base, and it looks mostly like I wanted to. Best spray it ready for painting. Oh look, magic! With our primed plinth left to bake for a while, now we have to start painting the base. I use the same colours as I did on the other wooden parts of the Mini. Next I dry brush all the little stones and rocks with another brown. I then pick out the stones under the tree, the little rocks on the floor, and the plants with the correct respective colours. Following this, we go for another green dry brush. A dry brush is a great way to hit all the little textures we have on the base. We follow this with some more washes, some more dry brushing, and we hit the flowers with our super bright magenta colour. I love this colour. I felt to start with that this colour might take away from our evil vibe for the Mini, but I feel like we can lean into super bright equals poisonous vibe, like frogs. These flowers are now frogs. While my brain wanders to brightly coloured frogs, we can see that I'm layering on the details of the plants on the base. Just like before, base colour, add some ice yellow, you know it, and start to bring up the highlights. This also happens for the stone. Finally, we do the tree. The tree gets the same purple then ice yellow highlights like the log our elf is standing on. Let's hit some tunes and get those layers all added. With the tree done, I start to brighten up my frogs, I mean flowers. I have a very bright pink colour from Vallejo that I add over the magenta. After a layer, add some white and go up the layers. I really like how these flowers turned out. Now it's time for me to bare my heart. My big ass evil heart that is. Of course it has to be purple. Evil underground forest and elf corrupting hearts need to be evil. We start with a dark purple as a base coat. I didn't prime this, so I hope it doesn't all come off later. With the base done, I hit it with a red wash to make it look icky. Now it's layer time. I use the same purple I have previously as a highlight colour on the elf boy, and I start to layer up, leaving the icky bits underneath alone. Once the layers are done, I start to add some brighter colour to the mix. Bet you cannot tell what. And then I start to layer up the highlights. Finally, I take some blood for the blood god from Citadel and add it everywhere so it looks even more icky. I dry brush the hole our heart will live in and give it a red wash to be just as icky as the heart. Then I super glue the heart into the underground tunnel. We are on the home stretch, people, and this has already taken me much longer than I planned. Anyway, we are onto the skin. For this, I pulled out some old Vallejo skin tones I've not used in a while. I wanted to make it seem like the guy that has lost his head was a healthier dude than our log squatting executioner, but I still want them to look like they're from the same race or clan. To do this, I add a warm brown to my basic skin tone, Vallejo's naming, not mine, for the severed head, and I add the light purple from there to the same colour for our boy. This means I use similar paints, but they look different enough. I chose to also do the same with the hair. The concept art shows the log boy is a blonde, and I thought I would do that for both, but again tried to change it up with my highlights. To start this blonde hair, I take a yellowy brown from Citadel, Baylor brown from before, and base the whole thing. Then we go back to the skin. The ranger in this piece needs to look sickly, so I get the base tone and add some white grey to it. I do this so it desaturates the skin colour as we push up the highlights. I apply multiple layers of this each time with even more white. Can I find tunes that fit with our sickly elf dude?
Time to get ill.
While I'm using my grey-white paint, I hit the eyes of the Mini. This is one of my first 75mm scale models, and it's nice to have bigger eyes to paint. That does also mean that I need to make them look right. For our severed head, I think he needs a name. Let's go with Brian. For Brian, I don't add white, but ice yellow. I want him to look as healthy as a man can when his head is removed from the body. For the hair, I take the base colour and add in some ice yellow, of course. I add progressively more and try to hit the sculpted hairs. For a ranger, I do the same process, but I add light grey to the mix too, trying to make the hair colour look similar, but not quite the same. This guy needs some vitamins. We are nearing the end of the Mini, which makes me excited. With the hair done, I want to do the horns or antlers. I use my standard bone recipe for this, mixing burnt umber with Citadel's Ushapti bone, and layering up again and again. For those keen-eyed people, you can see one antler has a messed up bit. That's because I dropped him. I knocked this off multiple times during the paint job. One point I lost the antler for an hour. dark times. Not sure if you noticed, but Brian is missing his ears. Turns out Ranger Guy inflicts on others what maybe he wants himself. These ears are stuck to the back of the quiver. They get the same treatment as the skin of Brian's face. Now it's time to add some more purple to our skin. I got a very thinned down purple paint, same as we used before, and added to the crevices of the skin. I also put purple and black in the eyes. I want to add this purple to really give a sickly tone, and to tie it in with the purple used elsewhere. Not sure if it's apparent, but someone has been beheading people. That tends to leave a bit of a mess. I take blood for the blood god, a great pain, and apply it to the blade, moving my brush against the direction that the blade would have gone through Brian's neck. This also gets added to Brian's ears and chopped throat. I had this whole section planned on doing some really gory bits on the bottom of the severed head, but it's very hard to see and I ran out of time. So here we are, it's done. I add some extra tiny bits to the base, stuck it all together. I should probably show you, right? Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed seeing this piece come to life. Stay tuned for more, and don't forget to check out Miniac's channel, linked down in the description.